Undercover boss steps into his luxury restaurant, freezes when he hears the kitchen, mislead a guest. Julian Hayes stood outside the glass facade of Hayes Hearth, the flagship fine dining restaurant that still bore his family name in gold script across the marble awning. 7 locations now, a legacy he had built from a single kitchen. But he hadn't stepped inside this particular branch in almost 18 months. Reports from the operations team had been mixed. Reviews remained mostly glowing, reservations full, but quietly complaints had begun to creep in. Whispers about inflated menus, substitutions without disclosure, questionable sourcing behind dishes that claimed to be imported. Something didn't sit right. He adjusted his disguise in the tinted window of a parked town car. A scruffy beard, thick reading glasses, and a weathered gray pea coat over a black turtleneck made him look more like a weary traveler than a multi-millionaire restaurateur. Perfect. No one would recognize him. With a steadying breath, he stepped inside. The smell of aged balsamic, seared duck fat, and polished silver filled the air. Crisp white linens, soft classical music. A server in a pressed vest nodded as he passed but didn't pause. Good. His anonymity was intact. Julian made his way to a corner two-top, near enough to the kitchen door to hear, but distant enough to observe. He requested only water and quietly opened the leather-bound menu. Everything looked elegant, refined, exactly as it should be. But as a waiter at the next table began to wax poetic about imported truffle puree and French foie gras, Julian's gut twisted. He knew what they were supposed to be serving, and he knew what hadn't been in the last supply shipment. He leaned back in his seat, listening. Something was off, and this time, he was here to see it for himself. Julian didn't need long to spot the first fracture. The waiter approaching his table wore a warm smile and a name tag that read Ethan Cole. He moved with the smooth confidence of someone who had worked the floor for years. Polished, practiced, almost rehearsed. His dark vest was perfectly tailored, his tone gentle but calculated, like a wine pour measured to the last drop. "Good evening, sir," Ethan greeted. "Would you like a suggestion from our chef's favorites?" Julian nodded mildly, closing the menu with quiet precision. "I'd recommend the risotto al tartufo," Ethan said, voice low and reverent, like he was sharing a secret. "Made with imported white truffle puree from Alba. We get it flown in every Friday. Earthy, delicate, rare. You'll love it." Julian raised a brow slightly but said nothing. He nodded again and murmured a soft, "Sounds good." He had personally stopped the Alba shipments 6 months ago. The cost had skyrocketed. The supply wasn't sustainable. They were using a domestic blend now. Synthetic oils folded into frozen slivers from Oregon. The paperwork sat in his briefcase. But to Ethan, this wasn't a discrepancy. It was a script. Julian tucked the thought away like a stone in his pocket. As Ethan turned to deliver the order, Julian glanced past him toward the kitchen door. It swung open briefly, revealing a flash of controlled chaos. Clattering pans, steam hissing off stainless steel, chefs barking times in clipped French. Near the prep station, a younger server whispered something to one of the line cooks. She couldn't have been more than 26, with curly auburn hair tucked under a simple bun. Her name tag said Natalie. She was frowning. "I watched him pull that truffle from the freezer this morning," she muttered to the cook, a wiry man in his 30s with sleeve tattoos peeking out from under his chef's coat. "Warehouse stock. Same batch from last week." The cook, Mason, shrugged with a practiced indifference. "You want to keep your job? Don't look so hard." Julian's eyes narrowed. He missed Natalie's full reply, but he saw her lips press into a tight, uneasy line as she turned away. His meal arrived 10 minutes later, artfully plated, fragrant, creamy grains nestled beneath shaved truffle, microgreens placed with surgical precision. Ethan returned with a flourish and a smile. "Enjoy, sir. Let me know if you'd like a pairing. We've got a Piedmont Chardonnay that matches the truffle's acidity perfectly." Julian smiled politely. "Sounds like you know your pairings." Ethan's grin widened. 14 years in this business, sir. It becomes instinct." Julian took a bite. The risotto was good, rich, well-balanced. But the flavor of a real Alba truffle? Nowhere to be found. The domestic oil left a synthetic echo, something a trained palate wouldn't miss. Julian didn't need the evidence. The lie was already spoken. He chewed slowly, then reached for his glass of water. Across the dining room, Natalie had taken over a new table, but her eyes flicked toward Julian's plate once, then away. Her expression wasn't judgmental. It was guilt, as if she'd just watched a stranger get handed a counterfeit and couldn't speak up without consequence. Julian set his fork down. The dish had been described as an experience, a culinary journey, a rare indulgence. But it was just deception wrapped in butter. He looked again at Ethan, now engaged in conversation with a couple near the fireplace, hands moving theatrically as he described imported duck and artisan black garlic aged in clay from Sicily. Julian didn't need to hear the whole pitch. He'd heard enough. In the corner, Natalie stood still for just a moment, arms crossed, back stiff, before walking into the kitchen. She hadn't served Julian. She hadn't said anything to him directly. But somehow in this room full of candles, wine, and polished service, she was the only one who hadn't tried to sell him something. Julian folded his napkin neatly across the table. His mind wasn't racing, it was anchoring. He came here tonight hoping to understand why something felt off. Now he knew. It wasn't just one dishonest waiter. It wasn't just one overpriced truffle dish. It was a culture, a system that rewarded performance and punished truth. A kitchen that knew the ingredients were swapped. A manager who likely knew and chose silence. But also, somewhere in that system, a crack of light. A young woman who saw the lie and didn't look away. Julian leaned back and exhaled through his nose. This would not be a quiet dinner. It would be the beginning of something much louder. Julian didn't rush. He lingered, letting the energy of the restaurant flow around him. Wine glasses clinking, laughter rising and fading, the steady rhythm of silverware meeting porcelain. Hayes Hearth had always been about experience, not just food, an orchestration of elegance. But tonight, behind the curtain of sophistication, he was beginning to hear the dissonance. After the risotto, he ordered another dish, the foie gras. Ethan returned almost proudly, recommending it with the same showman's flair. "You'll love this," he said. "Direct from Lion. Our chef insists on that particular region. The texture is unreal, silky smooth, no freezing involved, truly authentic." Julian nodded as if impressed, but he wasn't. He had personally signed off on cutting the Lion foie gras 6 months ago. Sourcing had grown too complicated, politically and financially. They'd replaced it with a domestic variety from upstate New York, still high quality, but not imported, not French, and certainly not what Ethan just promised. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, and it was happening under his name. The plate arrived, visually flawless, topped with a balsamic reduction and toasted brioche. Julian took a slow bite, savoring the richness more for the sake of memory than for taste. He knew the difference, the mouthfeel, the depth. There was pride in domestic sourcing when done honestly. But this was a theater built on a script that no longer aligned with reality. Ethan returned with a bottle. "May I pour you something to complement that, sir?" Julian tilted his head. "What would you recommend?" Without missing a beat, Ethan launched into a monologue about a rare vintage Chianti that just arrived from Tuscany, his tone reverent, almost performative. He poured gracefully, then stood back like an artist admiring his own canvas. Julian tasted it. Californian, medium-bodied. He'd been to the vineyard. Still, he said nothing. Because the performance hadn't ended, and the most revealing part of any performance is what people do when they think the audience doesn't know the script. Behind him, the door to the kitchen creaked open again. He turned slightly, just enough to catch Natalie walking out with a tray of bread for another table. She looked tired, not physically, but morally. The kind of tired that comes from watching people lie in plain sight while no one else seems to care. Their eyes met, just for a second. And in that second, Julian saw everything. The doubt, the restraint, the quiet ache of someone too junior to make noise, but too honest to pretend. Then she looked away and continued working. When dessert was offered, a house-made citrus panna cotta, Julian declined. He didn't want sweetness. He wanted the truth, and he was ready to ask for it. As Ethan returned with the check, Julian reached into his coat pocket. Instead of a wallet, he pulled out a folded napkin. He wiped the corners of his mouth gently, then set it down beside the untouched wine glass. "Mr. Cole," he said evenly, "I think I've heard enough for tonight." Ethan blinked. I'm sorry?" Julian stood slowly. His movements are deliberate, calm, but his eyes, sharp behind the thick reading glasses, never wavered. With one hand, he removed the glasses. The other pulled away the false beard, revealing the jawline, the face, the unmistakable presence of the man whose name adorned every wine list, every menu, every embroidered vest in the room. The room didn't go silent, but it shifted. Like a piano string suddenly out of tune, Ethan's face turned gray. He stepped back involuntarily, his hand still holding the bill folder as if it could shield him. "Mr. Hayes," he stammered. I didn't know." "I can tell," Julian interrupted. He turned toward the kitchen and gestured calmly to a nearby host. "Please ask the restaurant manager and Chef Allen to join us. Right now." The host nodded, eyes wide, and rushed off. Ethan stood frozen, eyes darting across the room. A few nearby staff began to whisper. Natalie had stopped mid-step near the bread station, her brows lifted in disbelief. Julian glanced at her. Just once, a quiet signal. "You were right." And then he turned back to Ethan, his voice low but firm. "You told me the truffle was from Alba, the foie gras from Lyon, the wine from Tuscany." Ethan swallowed hard. That's what we've always said. It's part of..." Julian raised a hand. "You don't have to say more. You already said everything I needed to hear." From behind the kitchen doors, the sound of rapid footsteps approached. Camilla, the general manager, appeared first, poised, professional, but already pale. Behind her, Chef Allen emerged in his pristine whites, confusion etched on his face. Julian didn't greet them. He didn't need to. He simply looked at both of them and said quietly but clearly, "Let's talk." And in that moment, the illusion of Hayes and Hearth's perfection cracked. Not with a shout, not with a scene, just with truth, calmly, unmistakably stepping back into the room. They gathered in the private lounge off the wine cellar, a space usually reserved for VIPs and special tastings. Tonight, it held a different kind of gravity. Julian stood near the decanter shelf, arms crossed, as Camilla DeVries and Chef Alan Park took their seats. Ethan lingered by the door, half hunched, his confidence fully drained. No one spoke first, so Julian did. "When was the last time either of you reviewed the ingredient sourcing sheets for this location?" Camilla hesitated. Her voice was smooth, polished. "We've been focusing more on experience and staff performance metrics, to be honest, but the suppliers changed 6 months ago," Julian cut in. "I made the call myself. The Alba truffles were dropped for cost efficiency. So were the foie gras imports from France, and the last case of Tuscan wine. Gone for 8 weeks. You approved the switch to Napa Valley." Camilla's lips parted, but no words came. Julian's tone didn't rise. It didn't need to. He turned to Alan. "And you? The kitchen's your domain. Did you know your team was still describing these dishes as imported?" Alan leaned forward, the lines on his forehead deepening. "I knew the changes had been made, but the descriptions, I assumed front of house was still using the older phrasing. It's more marketable." Julian blinked. "Marketable?" Alan adjusted his chef's coat, suddenly flushed. "Customers don't ask to see shipping manifests. They care about flavor, experience, and ambiance. These phrases, they're part of the magic." "And the truth?" Julian asked, steady. "Where does that fit in your menu?" A long silence followed. Camilla folded her hands neatly. "We didn't intend to deceive anyone. It's just easier to keep the language consistent. Our reviews are strong. The guests seem satisfied." "The guests don't know they're being misled," Julian said. "That's not satisfaction. That's performance." Ethan, still at the door, finally spoke. "We're not the only fine dining spot in the city that does this, you know. Everyone does it. No one's getting truffles flown in fresh daily unless it's Michelin-starred. Julian looked over his shoulder. And do you think that makes it right? Ethan shrugged, arms crossed. It's how this business works. No, Julian replied. It's how bad restaurants work. He walked slowly to the center of the room. Each step echoed faintly against the stone walls. I built Hayes Hearth with the belief that transparency was part of luxury. That when someone paid 3 figures for a plate, they weren't just paying for ambiance. They were paying for trust. He looked back at Camilla and Alan. And if this team, my most trusted, most seasoned, decided that illusion mattered more than integrity, then I've clearly let something rot from the inside out. Camilla inhaled deeply, her posture faltering. We didn't want to jeopardize the guest experience. We thought we were protecting the brand. Julian softened slightly, not in what he felt, but in how he delivered it. The brand is nothing without honesty, and a lie, even a small one, told night after night, fork by fork, is still a lie. There was a pause. Then Julian turned toward the side of the room where Natalie stood, partially hidden behind the cellar's wood-paneled archway. He motioned for her. Would you step in, please? Natalie froze, eyes wide, but she stepped forward, quiet, composed. Her apron still dusted from the shift, her hands clasped tight behind her back. Julian nodded to her, then faced the others. This young woman told the truth, not loudly, not for credit, not even to me, but because she knew it was wrong to pretend, and no one listened. Camilla glanced toward Natalie, guilt flickering in her expression. Julian continued, starting tonight, that changes. This culture of quietly bending facts to make margins, of prioritizing polish over principle, ends here. He looked directly at Camilla. You're the general manager. Do you believe we can rebuild this the right way? Camilla's voice was quiet. Yes, if we're willing to be honest, really honest, with ourselves and with our guests. Julian turned to Chef Alan. And you? Alan gave a slow nod. I'll rework the descriptions myself, from scratch. I'll taste every supplier's product again if I have to. Julian's expression didn't shift, but there was a small breath of something else now. Not quite relief, but readiness. Then he looked at Ethan. Go home. I'll speak with you tomorrow. Ethan didn't argue. He simply walked out, eyes fixed on the floor. Julian remained still for a moment, then turned back to Natalie. Thank you, he said simply. She blinked, surprised. I didn't think anyone was listening. I was, Julian said. And tomorrow, everyone else will be too. He walked to the cellar door and opened it. The music from the dining room drifted in, soft, gentle, unchanged. But everything else had shifted. And in the quiet of that basement room, the foundation of Hayes Hearth began its rebuild. Not with announcements or campaigns, but with a single truth spoken by someone no one thought mattered. Until now. Natalie sat across from Julian in his private office on the top floor of Hayes Hearth. The clatter of dishes and soft chatter of guests felt miles away now, muffled beneath walls of walnut paneling and old black and white photographs of the restaurant's earliest days. There was no scripted service voice here, no silver tray between them, just 2 people and the weight of everything unspoken. She clasped her hands in her lap, eyes flicking briefly to the framed photo behind him. Julian, 10 years younger, standing with his sleeves rolled up beside a steaming pan, and his late mentor, Chef Alvaro. It didn't look like a CEO's office. It looked like someone who still remembered what it meant to work the line. Julian didn't sit right away. He stood by the window watching the city lights blink through the Manhattan mist. Then gently, why did you say something, Natalie? When you corrected Ethan, when you whispered the truth to Mason, you knew someone could have overheard, and you didn't know I was watching. She hesitated, then looked up. Because it was wrong. Her voice didn't shake. It wasn't loud, but it carried something solid, a quiet certainty that didn't ask for approval. Julian finally turned. You could have kept your head down, let it slide. Most would have. I know, she said, but guests trust us. They order thinking they're getting something rare, something special. And if it's just frozen truffle oil from a warehouse, That's not just dishonest, it's disrespectful. Julian watched her closely. No script, no agenda, just truth, raw and unpolished. I wasn't trying to start anything, she added softly. But when I saw him say it, again, I just couldn't let it go. He nodded slowly, walked to the chair across from her, and sat, his shoulders slightly looser now. Tell me what else you've seen. Natalie hesitated. It's not just Ethan, she said carefully. Sometimes it's the language. Sometimes it's the plating. Last month, we served a duck confit with rosemary mash, but the duck came pre-cooked, vacuum packed from the supplier. The kitchen just reheated it and crisped the skin. Julian frowned. Who approved that? Chef Allen, she said, but I think it came from above. It was faster, more cost-efficient. One of the sous chefs pushed for it. Julian leaned back. And the staff? Most don't say anything. A few don't care. But some of us, we just started keeping our heads down. Natalie paused, choosing her words. I didn't join Hayes Hearth to microwave high-end food. I wanted to be part of something that cared. That stood for something. Julian looked down at his hands. The calluses were long gone, but memory remained in the bones. Of late nights, burned forearms, tasting spoons still hot from the pan. You know, he said after a pause, I used to say that the soul of a restaurant isn't in the dining room. It's in the back hallway, the space between the walk-in fridge and the dish pit. Natalie tilted her head. Why there? Because that's where people say the truth, Julian said. When no one's listening, when they're just being who they are. Natalie's lips curled into the faintest smile. That's where I told Mason about the truffles. Julian smiled too, a small, tired thing, but real. He stood again, walking over to his desk, opened the bottom drawer, pulled out a folder and handed it to her. What's this? She asked, opening it. Something I was working on before the expansion. A role we never filled. Quality and integrity officer. Someone who audits sourcing, verifies our promises, and talks directly to me. She blinked. But I'm a server. Julian nodded. With a better moral compass than half my executive team. He let that sit for a moment. I'm not offering you a title because you were loud. I'm offering it because you were quiet and still chose to speak. She looked down at the folder, then back up at him. Are you sure? No, he admitted, but I'd rather rebuild this place beside someone who's still idealistic than with people who think deception is just part of the job. Natalie closed the folder slowly. Her fingers rested on the embossed logo. Not Hayes Hearth in gold, but her own name typed clean across the top. A role that wasn't about position, but about principle. I'll do it, she said finally, but only if we mean it. No half-truths, not quite looking away. Julian met her eyes, something resolute in his expression. We'll do it right, he said, or we won't do it at all. From that quiet room above the dining floor, a new culture began, not through a marketing campaign or a staff memo, but with a folded folder and a girl who chose truth when it cost her nothing, and changed everything. Julian didn't sleep much that night. After his conversation with Natalie, he'd stayed behind long after the last guest left, walking the floor of the dining room in silence. Each table reminded him of something, an anniversary, a proposal, a quiet lunch between a father and daughter. This place had meant something. It had stood for something. And somehow, in the middle of expansion plans, chef partnerships, and PR-driven seasonal menus, they'd let the soul of it slip through the cracks. By morning, Julian had made up his mind. He arrived early, not in disguise this time, but in the dark navy suit that still fit like memory. No tie, just an open collar, sleeves rolled, and the gravity of a man who had decided this day would mean something. At 11:15, just before pre-shift briefing, he stepped out into the center of the dining room. The murmur of side conversations stopped instantly. Servers in black pressed uniforms turned toward him. Bartenders paused mid-pour. Two sous chefs froze in the doorway from the kitchen. Camilla, the restaurant manager, stood near the espresso station, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to read the moment. Julian didn't raise his voice, but when he spoke, the room listened. "I built Hayes and Hearth because I believe food could be sacred," he said. "That's what we serve, and how we serve it says something about who we are." A hush swept over the team. Some lowered their eyes. Others looked straight at him. He continued, "But last night I sat in this dining room as a stranger. I listened to stories about imported truffles that weren't imported, about foie gras that didn't come from France, about menus built on illusion." He paused. "Let the weight settle. I saw lies being passed off as a presentation, and the worst part wasn't the deception, it was the ease with which it was accepted, as if this was just the way things work now." Camilla stepped forward cautiously. "Julian, He held up a hand, not unkind, but firm. "No justifications. Not today." He turned to the entire staff now, voice steady. "From this moment forward, that culture ends. We do not lie to guests. We do not exaggerate ingredients. We do not build fine dining off false promises. If we say it's imported, it will be. If we say it's handmade, it will be." There was a shift in the air. Discomfort, tension, and something else underneath it. Relief. A line cook in the back nodded, almost imperceptibly. A bartender crossed his arms, skeptical but silent. Julian stepped forward. "This afternoon, service will pause. We are closing for one full day of retraining. Every staff member will attend. No exceptions." Camilla's eyes widened. "Julian, that's a full Friday. We'll lose. We'll lose more if we don't," he said. A soft murmur moved through the group. He continued before it grew. "Every menu item will be reviewed. Every ingredient will be audited. Every supplier will be verified. And every staff member, from the kitchen to the front of house, will recommit to the truth." It was then that Natalie stepped out from behind the server station. She didn't look nervous. She looked ready. "I know it's hard to change," she said quietly. "I know some of you have done it this way for years. But if we want guests to trust us again, we can't fake trust. We have to earn it." A few heads turned toward her. Mason, the kitchen assistant, gave a subtle nod. Others followed, slowly like a tide shifting. Camilla looked at Julian, uncertain. "And if we get pushback? If some don't want to follow?" Julian looked her in the eye. "Then they don't belong here." He didn't say it with cruelty. He said it like someone drawing a boundary, one long overdue. He turned back to the team. "This restaurant carries my name, but it's not mine anymore. It belongs to every guest who walks through that door, believing what we say. And it belongs to every one of you who still remembers why we started this place in the first place." There was no applause, but there was something better. Silence, the kind that comes when people are listening, not just hearing. Julian let it linger. Then finally, "Let's clean the slate. We open again tomorrow. New menu, new truth, new standard." He stepped back. Camilla, after a moment, walked beside him, not resisting anymore. Natalie stood firm near the host stand, and around the room, a dozen small nods began to form the first pieces of something new. Not a revolt, not a rebellion, but a rebuild, starting not with the strongest, but with the most honest. That afternoon, the restaurant floor was silent. No clinking glasses, no murmurs of conversation over candlelight, no scent of seared duck or buttered escargot drifting from the kitchen. Just quiet. The doors of Hayes and Hearth remained locked to the public, and inside, Julian stood at the center of the dining room with a clipboard in one hand and the entire staff seated in front of him. Not as employees, but as witnesses to change. Beside him stood Camilla, the manager who only yesterday had avoided confrontation, but now looked resolved, her shoulders squared as if she knew this was her second chance. They had spent the morning reviewing every section of the menu, item by item. Julian began by placing 2 bottles of truffle oil on the table. One labeled imported from Alba, the other unlabeled, generic, mass-produced. This, he held up the Alba bottle, cost $200 to $60 per liter. We haven't ordered it in 6 months. He turned slowly, looking around the room. And yet it's been described to customers every night. Mason shifted awkwardly near the back. He didn't speak, but he didn't look away either. "We're not just selling food," Julian continued. "We're selling trust. If they can't believe us about this, he held the bottle higher, why should they believe anything else? One by one, they pulled the menu apart. The Lion foie gras, replaced with a domestic version during supply shortages. But no one updated the script. The Amalfi lemon tart, switched to standard grocery lemons months ago. The Barolo wine reduction, made with a Napa Valley Merlot. Julian didn't yell. He didn't shame. He simply held up the truth, let the silence follow, and then made the choice to correct it. We're removing 7 dishes from the menu, he said. Until we can source honestly, we will not serve them. Camilla made notes quickly, glancing at him for confirmation. He nodded. Then he turned to the guest experience team. From this day forward, every menu will have ingredient transparency. Local or imported. Fresh or frozen. No more vague words like house special if it's reheated. No more handmade if it's delivered in plastic. Natalie sat toward the front, taking notes, her brows furrowed with quiet focus. She wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but everyone knew she had been the first to speak the truth. Julian watched her scribble something in the corner of her page. Ingredient cards, she murmured aloud without realizing. At the table, like wine pairings, except truth pairings. Julian smiled, the first smile in hours. Build a prototype, he said gently. Let's try it. Next came the guest recovery program. Camilla stood up and addressed the team herself this time. We've identified 32 guest complaints in the past quarter that mention misleading descriptions. From tonight, we'll be reaching out to each of them personally. No copy-paste responses, just truth, an apology, and an invitation. They would each receive a private dinner for 2, fully covered with the new transparent menu in hand. Julian added softly, not to win them back, but to honor what we broke. Someone from the pastry team, a woman named Grace who rarely spoke, raised her hand. What if some of them don't forgive us? She asked, voice thin. Julian nodded. They don't have to, he said, but we still have to make it right. He turned to the kitchen staff. Starting tomorrow, we'll begin retraining on both technique and language. If it's a domestic duck confit, say so. If the burrata is made in Jersey and not Puglia, say that too. And if anyone is uncomfortable serving a dish that doesn't align with our promise, you speak up. No more fear. No more silence. There was a pause, not defensive, not bitter, just a long, collective exhale, the kind that comes when a system begins to release its own weight. And then, from the back, Mason, the kitchen assistant, who had confirmed the truth to Natalie, raised his hand. Do you want us to memorize everything again? He asked, half challenging, half curious. Because I'm not great at scripts. Julian looked at him, a faint smirk in his eyes. No scripts, he said, just facts. If you know where it came from and how it's made, that's enough. And if you don't know, ask. Don't sell what you don't understand. It was quiet again after that, but the silence no longer felt heavy. It felt ready. That evening, long after the team had been dismissed and the prep crew returned to reorganize the walk-ins and toss out unlabeled ingredients, Julian lingered in the kitchen. He opened the walk-in cooler. There were labeled bins now. Inventory sheets were tacked up neatly. Natalie had already started creating draft cards for menu transparency. Camilla had emailed every regional supplier to confirm sourcing agreements. Slowly, something was changing. And this time, not because of pressure, but because of permission. Tomorrow they would reopen. Smaller menu, slower service, honest language. But Julian knew, if they did this right, the trust they'd rebuild would be stronger than any imported truffle ever could be. The following morning, just as the sun was brushing golden light across the rooftops of Midtown, Julian sat alone in his office upstairs. The restaurant wouldn't open for another 6 hours, but one conversation couldn't wait any longer. He reached for the intercom. Camilla, send Ethan in. Downstairs, Ethan Cole had just arrived, early for once. Still dressed sharply, hair slicked as always, his expression unreadable as he stepped into the room. For a moment, neither man spoke. Julian stood. He didn't offer a seat. Do you know why you're here? He asked. Ethan gave a half smile. I assume it's not to discuss wine pairings. Julian didn't blink. You told a customer that our truffle was imported from Alba. You said the foie gras came from Lion. You sold them a dream, and you knew it wasn't true. Ethan let out a breath, calm but cool. That's what fine dining is, Julian. Presentation, feeling, atmosphere. The plate doesn't just feed, it convinces. Julian raised an eyebrow. And deception is just garnish? I gave them the experience they paid for, Ethan replied, his voice even, rehearsed. Do you really think guests come here to fact-check duck origins? They want romance, elegance, prestige. Julian paced slowly to the window, looking down at the empty dining room. You know what they really want, he said, more to the glass than to Ethan. To believe in something, to taste honesty, to feel cared for, not managed. He turned back, his voice firmer now. If our guests need lies to feel luxury, then we've failed. But I don't believe that, and I won't run a place that operates on that assumption. Ethan tilted his head. I've worked in this industry for 20 years. I've seen what sells, what doesn't. Trust me, they're not coming back here for raw transparency and handwritten ingredient cards. Julian's voice dropped to a low, calm certainty. They will, because we're not selling fantasy anymore. We're selling truth, carefully prepared, genuinely served. For the first time, Ethan's mask cracked slightly. His brow tightened. So what happens now? You rewriting the whole business around idealism? No, Julian said quietly, around integrity. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a manila envelope. This is your severance. 3 months, no NDA, no bad blood, but you won't be a part of this place moving forward. Ethan's jaw worked as if forming a rebuttal, but stopped. There was nothing left to say. He took the envelope without another word. As he reached the door, Julian spoke again, not harshly, but like someone who had once believed in him. You're talented, Ethan, but talent without values. That's just performance, and I'm not in the business of performance anymore. Ethan paused, then left. The door clicked softly behind him. Julian stood in the silence that followed, feeling more relief than regret. He hadn't done this to punish, only to protect something that had been lost, and that finally was starting to come back. Downstairs, Natalie was adjusting the new menu displays. Next to each featured dish was a small folded card, not decorative, but factual. She had handwritten everyone. Truffle puree, black winter, domestic, sourced from Oregon. Duck breast, free range, Pennsylvania farm. No embellishment, no poetry, just pride and truth. Camilla walked by, pausing briefly. She's been here since 6, she whispered to Julian. Didn't even take her break. Julian nodded, watching from the stairs. I know. He walked slowly into the kitchen where Mason was double-checking new labels on the prep bins. Chef Allen's coming in later, Mason said without being prompted. He asked if we could do a blind tasting, see if the new domestic foie still sings with the apple cider glaze. Julian smiled faintly. Good, let the food prove itself. That night, when Hayes Hearth reopened to guests, there were fewer items on the menu. Service was a little slower. The energy was a little more tentative. But the eyes of the staff, for the first time in months, looked steady, grounded. When one guest raised an eyebrow at a menu note that said non-imported truffle, Natalie smiled gently and explained the sourcing. The man nodded with unexpected appreciation. Nice to know someone's honest. Julian, watching from the service bar, exhaled slowly. No applause, no grand reveal, just a small, quiet shift. Exactly where change begins. A week passed. The white tablecloths at Hayes Hearth were still perfectly pressed. The crystal glasses still caught the candlelight just right. But something invisible had changed. Something deeper than service protocols or plating technique. It was in the way Natalie carried the new ingredient binder to each curious guest who asked. In the quiet focus Mason brought to every prep station. In how Camilla now walked the floor with her sleeves rolled up and her ears open. Not to monitor, but to listen. Julian didn't issue a press release. He didn't need to. Word spread the way truth always does. Slowly, then suddenly. Reviews began to appear on food blogs and customer forums. Elegant, but honest. Refreshing to see a place this high-end embrace transparency. I actually trust what I'm eating here. But Julian hadn't done this for optics. He had done it because he believed, finally, that this restaurant, this team, could be better than the illusion it once sold. One morning before service, he gathered the entire staff in the main dining room. No podium, no spotlight, just him, standing at table 12 with a coffee in hand. "I know the last few days haven't been easy," he began. "Change rarely is." There were a few quiet nods. No one shifted away. "But I want you to know something. I didn't come back to catch anyone in a lie. I came back because I was afraid we'd lost something. Something I promised this place would always stand for." He glanced toward Natalie. She was near the window, arms loosely crossed, watching him with steady eyes. Julian continued. "What we serve matters, but how do we serve it? That's what lasts." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket, a printed email from an older couple who had dined 2 nights ago. They wrote, "Thank you for making truth a part of the recipe. We've been dining in this city for decades, and this is the first time we felt we could trust the story behind every bite." A beat of silence. Then Camilla, standing near the back, said softly, "That's what we're building now, isn't it?" Julian smiled. "Yes, and I want us to keep building it." He looked at Natalie once more, which is why, effective today, Natalie will be stepping into a new role. Quality Integrity Lead for all Hayes Hearth locations. Gasps. A few surprised glances. Natalie blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" Julian nodded. "You've done more for our values in 1 week than most do in a year. You have a good palate, but an even stronger compass. We need both." "But I'm not a chef," she said softly. "You don't have to be," Julian replied. "You just have to keep speaking up when something isn't right, and help others do the same." She didn't cry, but her throat tightened as she nodded. A quiet, almost disbelieving smile began to form. Julian turned back to the group. "There will be more changes. Training, ingredient sourcing reviews, open forums each month. But above all, this isn't just about systems. It's about culture, and culture begins with you." The room stood still, but in that stillness was something electric. Then Mason raised a hand. "Does this mean no more of those freezer truffle tubs from the warehouse?" A ripple of laughter broke the tension. Julian chuckled. "Exactly." That night, the restaurant filled as usual. Guests laughed over candlelight. Servers moved with grace. But more than once, someone stopped Natalie on the floor. "Thank you for being honest," they'd say. She'd smile, eyes bright. "It's the least we can do." And in the back corner, Julian sat at table 12 once again, sipping a single glass of Barolo, watching it all unfold. He hadn't built Hayes Hearth to chase stars or fame. He had built it to honor something. Now finally it felt like they were on the way back to it, quietly, steadily, one true plate at a time. Sometimes the most expensive thing on the menu isn't the food, it's the lie behind it. And sometimes the most valuable ingredient is integrity. Julian didn't rebuild Hayes Hearth with PR. He rebuilt it with truth, spoken not from the top, but from a young staffer who simply refused to pretend. Natalie didn't wear a title. She wore courage. And maybe that's the real recipe for trust. A team brave enough to tell the truth, and a leader strong enough to protect them. If this story moved you, if you believe kindness and honesty still belong in business, subscribe for more stories that remind us the smallest voice can change the whole room.